All right. Good morning, Vlado. Good morning here. It's not your morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
My name is Nir, and I'm the director of the Applied Ethics Center at UMass Boston. And this is the Ethics in Action podcast. And my friend and esteemed colleague, Vladimir Petrovic, aka Vlado, is a senior research fellow at the center, and he is also a senior researcher at the Institute for Contemporary History in Belgrade, where he heads its digital center, and an outstanding historian focusing recently on questions of transitional justice and genocide. And Vlado and I are going to have a few conversations about what the Ukrainian conflict means for Europe, for realignment of world powers. So, Vlado, I am very excited about this.
Thank you, dear Nir. Likewise.
Vlado, we thought we would focus our discussion today on the question of balance of powers, on whether that old idea is potentially making a comeback. So let me set this up and ask you in the following way. So after the fall of the Soviet Union and the crumbling of the so-called Iron Curtain, it seemed like we were ushering in a sort of American moment characterized by very broadly speaking, very broad strokes, liberal internationalism, some more soft power, a rise in the influence of global economic institutions, really an explosion in the influence of international law, significant buildup of institutions. From your area of specialty, the flourishing of some ad hoc and hybrid tribunals, the creation of the ICC, strengthening of international monetary institutions. The idea was from the Clinton administration that even China could be roped into this if its economy and infrastructure were modernized and made to depend more heavily on online trade and so on and so forth. So much so that famously, Fukuyama thought that this ushered in the liberal telos of history, the end of history. And even if it wasn't just the end of history, it seemed like a long vacation from history. Would it be, what do you think about the idea that this was going on? And maybe more importantly for our own conversation today, did that come crashing down with Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Did that American moment really sort of crumble down with these recent weeks? Russia sort of reasserting its interests in its backyard, aligning itself very openly with China, with the so-called partnership without an upper limit, as they like to call it these days. Do you think that the old sort of idea of the balance of powers, where countries are aligning with each other to check the power of other countries, is making a comeback?
So many issues are bundled in that seemingly easy question, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, it seems to me that there is no lack of evidence that something like that is happening. Even a random TV news today is putting us in that direction. I just basically turned off the TV, which was saying that there was a huge conference about Afghanistan held in China in the presence of foreign ministers of China, Russia, Pakistan, and several other countries from Central Asia. And I just heard Minister Lavrov speaking about NATO's desire to spread not only eastwards into, let's say, Ukraine, but also through Romania and Bulgaria and Turkey into the soft belly of the Middle East, and then I don't know where. This type of discourse and this type of rhetorics is not only resembling the Cold War rhetorics, but indeed goes into this pre-1914 idea of zones of influence, of competing alliances, of creating complex geopolitical metrics, and so on. So certainly there is a prima facie case that something like that is happening. However, when I think about comeback and what does it actually mean to come back, when as a historian, of course, I was taught very much so that history doesn't really repeat itself, but as Mark Twain puts it, it frequently rhymes, right? So there might be a certain comeback of a given philosophy which was actually probably always there below the surface. I hope we'll get to talk about it in some detail in a second. I would leave that for an open possibility, that simply this type of reasoning was always there, but we might have been oblivious to it. On the other hand, the type of pre-1914 geopolitical thinking is, I think, not conceivable today. Simply the world is vastly different. These 100 years have brought about so many different things that thinking of a multilateral or multi-central world now with nuclear powers all over the place is simply not the same thing as it was in pre-1914. So that needs to be entertained. It might be balance of powers again, but a different type of balance of powers with different types of challenges and different types of consequences should something run amiss. More global, and if I dare say, more terminal. And that puts us all in vastly different situation, including the policymakers, and well, literally all of us.
So we should just say, by a very brief way of background, that the maybe most famous display of the balance of powers, or the paradigm case of this, is in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, and in the Congress of Vienna, which is supposed to sort of generate the peace treaty that finally checks France's power in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. And there is a kind of realignment of power in Europe that is supposed to, by some kind of spreading of it between Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, France, to guarantee that no one country becomes as powerful as Great Britain, I'm sorry, as France under Napoleon was, and that ushers in a sort of relatively peaceful 100 years or so, 99 years, until World War I. Depending on what you think about the Franco-Prussian War, but it was still relatively peaceful, right? So that's the kind of historical paradigm. Now, when you say nothing like that could ever happen, what do you have in mind? Do you have in mind, for example, that some of the weapons and challenges that we have are such that can't sort of exist without some kind of coordination? Or could you say a little more about how this plays out as a variation, given the changes that you mentioned?
Absolutely. So indeed, there are certain parallels to the example you mentioned, to this concert of great powers, which was maintained over these 100 years through different sets of congresses. At first, it was the Holy Alliance, and then different types of temporary alliances and congresses of different size and scope that were maintained until, again, the thing ran amiss in the beginning of the 20th century. But actually, it's a funny thing when you come to think about it, that one of the greatest scholars of that period, Henry Kissinger, wrote a book. His first big important book was called The World Restored, and it dealt exactly with that, with the role of Metternich, Chancellor of the Austrian Empire, in setting up that system. So it's interesting that the same person is actually implicitly and explicitly a promoter of this idea of the contemporary concert of great powers. So he never ceased to be a realist in terms of international relations theory, claiming that this international veneer is basically only a window dressing, which is clouding our view and not allowing us to see the real thing, which is a struggle, sometimes bitter, sometimes cooperative relation between the great powers. But two things are substantially different. This European balance of power, I think, was partially dependent on the fact that all of these European powers were at the same time colonial powers, either maritime, settler colonial type of powers, or pretty much continental. So basically, it was European global balance of power which was being created in Vienna and afterwards. And in a sense, this is probably one of the main reasons that this thing collapsed, the frictions between the great powers for the most part because of their competing interests in the colonies over those resources. Those times are either gone or they might be framed in some sort of neo-colonialism. We can debate to which extent then the parallel would hold. This is one major difference. Another major difference is that it seems to me that the challenges which are ahead of us are different. They are global in nature. Not only a global nuclear exchange, which is certainly a major difference when it comes to strategic decision making and thinking who's the great power and who's not, and whether cooperation is better or the conflict can be more profitable, but also global warming, climate changes, global migrations. Those are all things which were simply not there, or at least they were not visible at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So it seems to me that it would be more difficult and probably more damaging today to simply renounce any sort of multilateralism or this enormous buildup of international institutions, which didn't really even start with the United Nations, or didn't even start with post-1989 or with Washington Consensus. I mean, that type of thinking and practice started pretty much the middle of the 19th century, in parallel with the concept of great powers. The Red Cross was formed in 1864. The first Geneva Conventions were made around that time, and then a slow and steady stream of thinking how the states should interact with one another. So basically, it would be difficult to completely negate that type of development and to return to the same old. It's possible, but we need to ask ourselves whether it's thinkable and also whether it's feasible.
So that's fascinating, because on the one hand, you know, I shared with you yesterday an op-ed that I found from you know, the English language Chinese Communist Party newspaper, and the argument that they make pretty explicitly there, you know, could have been literally lifted from these negotiations between Metternich and Castlereagh and the whole bunch there, and it essentially says, when one country becomes as strong as the United States became, other countries need to band together to check its force. Otherwise, the hegemony and values and economic interest will be bad for China and Russia and will be bad for the whole world. And that was from about a year ago, and in some ways explains, you know, the kind of close support that the Chinese are lending the Russians now as we speak. And actually, in, you know, some of the realist neighborhoods, you hear the kind of argument that says something like, well, the last time we had an explicit in-your-face kind of balance of power, it's true that it was a you know, reaction to the French Revolution. It's true that it was a reaction to the emergence of these kind of universalist values. And it ushered in, you know, a more conservative 19th century than many people wanted to see. But on the other hand, it was one of the most peaceful periods in, you know, recent world history. And 100 years of peace is not nothing, or 50 plus years of complete peace and another 50 years of partial peace is not nothing. That's the, you know, maybe we should look forward to this, right? And then your argument is, well, there are these global challenges that require some kind of multilateralism. And I guess, you know, that's absolutely right. And that's a crucial difference. But it seems like part of the problem is that the different blocks in this balance of power don't necessarily agree even that those are global challenges. So, for example, both Russia and China have an interest in a, shall we say, looking at climate change in a more subdued ways than the Americans do, right? For example, then a lot of now, you know, we here would say, of course not. The real interest is global. But I guess part of what I'm saying is these are exactly the kind of questions that get politicized between the different blocks. So, you know, even the idea that there are some challenges so large that they have to be dealt with on a multilateral fashion is taken to be, in some ways, an ideological commitment. So does it matter to Russia and China, for example, that there are the kind of challenges that can only be met multilaterally, and therefore there's real limits to the balance of power? Does it matter to them mainly that they want to limit the power of the other bloc?
Yeah, you did hit the nail in the head, because it boils down to the value of human life as well. And it boils down to the horizon of expectations. I mean, I hear frequently in the debates, everybody's trying to get into Putin's mind and then to decide if he was misinformed, if he's surprised, if he's this or that, and so on. But I never yet heard a somber analysis about his own temporal horizon for expectations. He has no elections to fear at this point. And neither does the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which means that their horizon of temporal expectations could be completely different. It's not limited to 4 years of being re-elected or something like that. Their concessions to the internal problems of their countries are completely different. The ability of Russians to suffer should not be underestimated, and so on and so forth. So these are all elements which are in the game. You might be completely right that they're just not interested in the same things. And not only they, but also within those societies, as well as like the West, there are people who are interested in different visions of the future. Not everybody is taking, let's say, 2050 as the point of observation and thinks about how the climate is going to be at that point, right? So that's certainly true. However, still, it seems to me that many of these issues boil down to what do we aim at? I think that many of these discussions are confusing two things, which is what do we hope for and what do we see? Prescriptive and descriptive understanding of the world. And I find it difficult in myself even to, of course, divide those two, given that we are, no matter how insignificant and limited, but still actors in that story. So describing a neo-realist world also borders with advocating for a neo-realist world, to my mind. Then again, it's to be really seriously entertained. I mean, I just remembered in preparation for this conversation, back in 1990, Francois Mitterrand, back then French president, and Margaret Thatcher, back then the Prime Minister of the UK, were seen literally as old fossils because they were worrying about the rise of unified Germany. And they held a number of meetings with their advisors about what does it mean, whether united Germany is going to ask for a place at the Security Council, whether it's going to ask for nuclear armament, what does it mean for Europe, what does it mean for France, Great Britain, and so on. But they were literally ridiculed because, in a sense, history made it obvious that unified Germany is not interested in European hegemony, at least not on the level of zones of influence. Economically, actually, perhaps, yes. But they were ridiculed because history didn't go that way, but that doesn't really mean anything. It's easy to be a general after the battle, right? So I think we are here to try to take this broader view. I don't know, what do you think about this idea that perhaps balance of power was actually always there, and that this idea of liberal interventionism or liberal democratic global order was not much more than a mirage?
Yeah, that was in some way going to be my my follow-up question. So that, I mean, to kind of frame that, especially in the context of the point you make about the descriptive versus prescriptive views of the world, how the world is and how the world should be. So a lot of realists in international relations, broadly speaking, realism, the idea that international relations are driven by actors trying to fulfill their interests and maximize their ability to achieve them rather than by some kind of principled aims and principled behaviors. A lot of realists will say that the balance of power is the best descriptive theory that we have to understand, world relations, and that it's a kind of system that aims at equilibrium. On that kind of explanation, in 89 to 91, the world equilibrium was broken, and it just took, depending on how you want to count, 10, 20, 30 years for it to start going back. So that essentially Fukuyama was very, very partially right. We got a short vacation from history, but there can be, no telos except that power wants to balance itself out. So what about that idea that they're never really, let's dig into that for a minute historically, that the balance of power, sort of post-Napoleonic wars, balance of power idea where powers checked each other, never really went anywhere, that there was, that the American internationalist liberal order, Western world ascendancy was a kind of moment of wishful thinking on our part. Vlada, what do you think is the evidence for that? What are a few sort of coordinates on the map?
So there are several issues there. Firstly, let's imagine that Cold War was a static system, and neorealists would typically say that this is kind of better than some sort of chaos, right? Because you have a certain stable system, and it was balance of two superpowers. True, but then we have to ask this old criminological question: cui bono? Who profits from it? So basically, it's not a common fact, but Cold War was really hot in many places, and more people died in wars by proxy all over the world than in the Second World War through these couple of decades. So for them, it didn't matter all that much that Cold War never grew into nuclear exchange, because they were dead anyhow. Therefore, not every stability is necessarily ethically, I think, favorable to chaos. Take this concert of powers. It worked very well for Metternich. It worked very well for France, because France was occupied, if you remember, and of course you remember, in 1814 and in 1815 again. So Russians in 1814 marched into Paris. But it didn't dawn to them that they should do what Americans and the Soviets did in Berlin, which is to stay there for an indefinite period of time. They said, okay, it's best to resurrect France, not in Napoleonic borders, but pretty much in pre-1789. Not because they liked the French or even Bourbons, but probably because they thought that this is the most feasible way to organize the post-Napoleonic world, right?
And because ironically, they're afraid of the Russians.
Exactly. And now I'm thinking, this is also wishful thinking of a general after the battle. But if similar courtesy was extended to Russians after 1991, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, perhaps the situation would be different now. Why? The theory, so Fukuyama's theory, actually, partially Fukuyama's, partially Kojève's, partially Hegel's, right? Relies on the idea that not only the democracy is the only game in town, but also the democracies don't wage war with one another. That's the democratic peace theory, right? I wonder, what do you think about that one, especially about its empirical foundations? Because if that stands, then a lot of the Fukuyamian thing could be, in a sense, vindicated, because it's still not a coincidence that this erosion of, let's say, dream about some cosmopolitan liberal international order goes hand in hand with erosion both of democracy and of liberalism and of human rights standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the democratic peace theorem, which kind of, traces back really to Kant, Kant and his notion of perpetual peace more than anything else. It's actually interesting. So that was investigated empirically, and it's both true and false. It's true that democracies don't wage wars with each other, that substantial democracies don't go to war with each other. And that has very strong evidence. Interestingly enough, though, and I'm forgetting the author who sort of writes the classical empirical piece on this. I can put it in the show notes later when I retrieve it. They go to war more frequently with non-democracies than non-democracies go to war with each other. So that's a weird combination. So a US and a Great Britain won't fight. But however, a US and an Iraq, for example, will fight more frequently than an Iraq and Saudi Arabia, or what have you. So that democracies fight non-democracies at a greater rate than non-democracies fight each other. So empirically, the democratic peace theorem is half vindicated. What's more interesting is Kant never advocated that, even if the democratic peace idea that democracies don't fight each other is true, Kant never advocated that then you should go and make the whole world a democracy. The idea was hopefully they evolve into democracies themselves and then there'll be less fighting. And the neoconservative sort of misreading at the time in the 90s was, well, if we make Iraq democratic, to the extent that that was some of the justification, there'll be a domino effect in the Middle East and we'll get a more favorable, more peaceful Middle East. That has no grounds, philosophical or otherwise. But so if the democratic peace theory were true, then Fukuyama's vindication would kind of depend on how long it would take for other places to become democratic. But the way I heard you initially was that you thought that the whole idea of the balance of power being dead after 1991 was very, very suspect. That in fact, there were many manifestations of it that we just didn't pay attention to because of our wishful thinking.
Yeah, well, I think that these entities can coexist. So there were a lot of utopian ideas in the 19th century as well, which coexisted with the idea of the balance of power. And you could peddle some ideology alongside. For instance, the Holy Alliance was also an ideological movement, and it's called the Holy Alliance for a reason, right? And that also brings me back to this question, yes, stability, but for whom? So this was a stability which was actually deepening the colonial order, right? So basically that type of stability was ravaging Africa at the same time, literally. That's just a side note. On the issue of permanent existence of the balance of power, anecdotically, I can tell you, so I had spent 1990s in Yugoslavia, and during that period, Yugoslavia bailed out on me. It literally collapsed and disintegrated, and its historical trajectory was completely out of space. If the whole world was raving about Fukuyama and was the Berlin Wall was falling, 1989, Unite Europe, 1992, European Union comes about, globalization, the new economical consensus. There were talks about the reform of the Security Council and that the United Nations should actually reflect some new world which is in the making. And the Yugos were busy with what is called ethnic warfare, recharting of the borders and the likes. And back then it was seen, just like the conflict in Rwanda, just like the conflict in the Middle East or sets of conflicts in the Middle East, as some bizarre anachronism. And this is exactly how the international community, whatever that might be, approached it. It made ad hoc tribunal to deal with it, just like it made ad hoc tribunal for Rwanda and then for Sierra Leone and so on. What does it mean? That means that these things were supposed to mop up those footnotes in history, which are the remnants of the violent 20th century of Europe as a dark continent, as Mark Mazower writes, and so on, until the International Criminal Court comes about, and it did in 1999 when the Roma Statute was signed, and then for real in 2001, basically from 2002. But it happened actually otherwise. What seemed to be a brutal last kiss of the 20th century at this point in time looks more like an avant-garde thinking. That basically this type of warfare is something that we are going to see, and we do see daily today. And I remember in those days, I was bemused by looking at the people who were strategizing like that. Look, this doesn't look good now, especially for the Serbs, but we have to wait a bit. We have to wait for 20 years or 30 or 40 years. Now, what are we waiting for? We are waiting for Russia to get from its knees, and we wait for China to really reassert its realistic position in the world. So you don't need to be Mearsheimer to get into that type of thinking, which was widespread from the very important people in the Academy of Arts and Sciences all the way down to the dude drinking a beer in front of the local drugstore, which means that probably there is a strong case to it, given that so many people were vested into this type of thinking, that this thing is just temporary. It's connected to this US hegemony, which was waning. Quite a while, actually, the US was proclaimed by Paul Kennedy, a Yale author who wrote the book about the rise and the fall of the great powers, as the world's only superpower in decline. That was his assessment of the position of the US as early as 1995 or so. It was clear to him that the US is not going to be able to be world's policeman and the #1 superpower indefinitely. And it has to strategize its decline. It's not so easy to get out of history gracefully. Some countries did it. The Netherlands actually did it successfully. Not many people remember now that the Netherlands used to be a global empire, let alone a slave-holding one. The Netherlands at this point is an extremely rich country which is promoting human rights left and right and is a standard in many ways of how to organize a polity, but it was of course all built on slave trade, among other things. The other countries are not as good in shrinking, let's say, or cutting down that leadership position. So that probably needs to be entertained. I wonder what's your reflection, and I dare asking a sort of a semi-personal question. So how did this dream, the Fukuyamian dream, look from the vantage point of the Middle East?
Yeah, no, that's a great, I think from the vantage point of the Middle East, nobody stopped believing in the balance of powers. I think there was sort of a view to who the dominant power at any given point in time was, and an attempt to align with it. So, when there was a Soviet Union, the Middle East split along the lines of, aligning with one or the other. When there wasn't, anybody who could tried to align with the Americans, or, alternatively tried to create a sort of local locus of power, potentially in Iran, potentially in Saudi Arabia. Part of what you're seeing now, by the way, interestingly enough, is the Israelis sort of figuring out that American power in the Middle East is waning and becoming a lot friendlier to the Russians, again, in the kind of way that small powers usually do ever since the days of the Peloponnesian War between the Athenians and the Spartans, when there is a shift in power. So part of why the Israeli response to the Russian invasion has been so muted is because they understand that they need Russian backing for their security challenges vis-a-vis the Syrians and Hezbollah and so on and so forth. So I think often small countries historically can only afford to see the world in terms of patrons and in terms of the balance of powers. And they assume that when there is one ascendant patron, it's not because an idea has won, but because temporarily one patron has a lot more money and a lot more force than the others. But I wanted to go back to something that you said that I found fascinating, that even if we assume that there was a sort of pretty long moment of liberal internationalism, and tell me if this is fair characterization of your point, but even if we assume that really what it was is a sort of window dressing on the ascendancy of some interest. So for example, how much did African nations benefit? How much did the Russians benefit? How much did the Chinese benefit from, the rise of liberal internationalism? Really, liberal internationalism was liberal internationalism for the rich in the first place. The others got left out and felt that it was a sort of bullshit description of internationalism when it was really parochialism. And as a result, sort of we're getting the pushback against that now. So that's a sort of reframing of your point. In some way, it's a reframing of Mearsheimer's point, which you sound pretty sympathetic to. Is that fair? So the idea would be part of why there never was an American moment is that there was never an American moment for everybody in the first place. And now we're just sort of getting the vindictive response to that.
So that's where perspective is completely at odds with my description. I was thinking while you were talking, why am I so petrified with this vision of the balance of powers coming back? And all my instincts and intuitions are telling me that abandoning any sort of global human rights yardstick is a one-way street.
Mhm.
There are several reasons why I think so. So firstly, the autocracies today, as well as democracies today, are both threatened and aided by unprecedented technological development as well. Imagine Stalin's paranoia and NKVD with the contemporary gadgets, cell phones, which are giving away your entire movement, your web browsing history and stuff like that. It would have been much worse. Imagine the Nuremberg laws seconded by MyHeritage, 23andMe, and other genetic tools. Horror, horror. And it seems to me that the autocratic regimes, if they stabilize at this point in time, are going to be extremely difficult to dislodge and would be potentially much, much nastier if threatened. That's one, let's say, dystopia, which completely petrifies me because it really resembles Orwell's 1984. And also, I wonder if the West actually would be able to sustain that type of a challenge or pressure, for different reasons that we might discuss now or at some other encounter. So that's one reason that I would not readily ascribe to this back to the future paradigm. If you remember, that was the title of an article by Mearsheimer from the beginning of the period we are discussing. The other reason is, of course, that balance of power leaves so many other things in the gray zone. So what's happening with the sovereign states, right? In the balance of power theory or practice, it's like 5 or 6 important global centers which matter. What do we do with the fact that there are United Nations? Do we just also scrap that as window dressing and just continue with the idea of like 5 or 6 huge blocks? Is that really feasible? And does one want to live in such a world ultimately?
Yeah. But I still wonder what you think about this. If we zoom out a little bit, it seems like from 1991 until very recently, there was one ascendant idea, and it was in some way the Western idea. And there was a disproportion in influence and power. There seems to be something about this moment that suggests that that has ended, or that that is coming to a halt. You are closer to a multipolar world, right? You once again have this kind of argument of zones of influence and backyards and all of that rhetoric, which wasn't taken that seriously for a while, which is, back on the map. So this, it started probably when, Syria was creating a neighborhood. I'm sorry, Russia was creating a neighborhood for itself once again in the Middle East. And now it's a sort of reassertion of its ability to stomp around in its own sphere of influence, on its own borders in Eastern Europe. That kind of talk will suggest that there's neighborhoods where nobody sort of messes. And that kind of talk hasn't been with us since the Cold War. And I guess part of what we're trying to figure out is, has it really not been with us, or, were we just distracted from it?
Yeah, so can I offer a metaphor? What if we think about it as a pendulum? A pendulum which swings, and at this point it swung tremendously in the direction of not only of balance of power, but actually of imbalance of power, of several power blocks which are in the making. They are themselves not sure whom are they aligned with. I will not be fooled by this Sino-Russian neo-friendship. It's not a stable entity, and historically it had not been, even when they were connected with the ideology, let alone now. Therefore, things are in turmoil in that regard. So the pendulum is really swinging, and it seems to me that it will take us a while to understand where we are at. The issue is, to me, whether the pendulum can be swung in another direction, or will it swing in another direction, because it's very self-defeating to throw away all the efforts of global thinking. I don't mean necessarily globalization, mondialization, and so on and so forth, but mere understanding that we are a part of the same species, and that we are even bound by self-interest and not only by moral obligations. To me, those things are so commonsensical that I will simply not let go of the old world, because I think it's plain dumb.
What would it take to swing it back, though? Especially given what you said earlier about the marriage of totalitarianism with technology.
Yeah, I admit it might as well be a lost cause, but I mean, I fought many lost causes. I mean, I was aiding war crimes prosecutions for over a decade and so on, without getting too many suspects. It's simply how it goes. But that doesn't mean that I would just allow war criminals to go around free if I can do anything about it. The thing is, enjoying life is a rather contemporary concept, I think. So we might as well be going back to the past in that respect. We did become, if I'm allowed, a bit self-indulgent, that we remember, I mean, simply forgetting that for the most part of recorded history, people didn't live as they wanted. That's a complete novelty, actually. So, yeah. But there is another thing that I wanted to mention.
It's interesting. I just wanted to sort of flag for you that there's this remarkable review of Mein Kampf by Orwell from 1940. Orwell says there that part of Hitler's success and part of Stalin's success is understanding that there's a lot of people who don't just want to enjoy their individual life and don't just want, to go to gym after work and, catch a good movie and have a nice coffee shop. I don't remember his specific examples, but rather really love flag waving and are really obsessed with self-sacrifice, and that there is something in us that kind of tends to that. And if you can play it off, if you can tap into it, that's in some ways either fascisms or armed socialism, as he called it, secret of success. That's the secret sauce. And you kind of see that playing out in Putin's propaganda. You see occasionally a version of it playing out in Chinese propaganda, although a very different version of it.
Well, your own work, I think, shows persuasively that emotions matter tremendously in international relations. And I hope you will allow me to spend at least one more episode talking exactly about that. I don't want us to unpack this really complicated thing in a hasty way. So it would be great if you could invite me again to talk solidly and to listen and to learn from you actually about the importance of emotions in informing narratives. Actually,
absolutely, that is one of our coming attractions.
Yeah, but about the pendulum still. So what does it take to get it back? That's at this point, of course, almost impossible to say. But I can say this much: if you hold a certain extreme theory, like neorealism and nothing else, like Mearsheimer, let's say, or liberal interventionism, globalist order, Fukuyama style, and so on. And if you live long enough, it's very likely that history will play that reality in your lap, ultimately. Because simply history is a mess. And what did Goethe say? Every theory is gray, only the tree of life is green. So basically, it's very likely that you will be occasionally right, in the way that Mearsheimer was completely wrong in the early 90s when he wrote about Back to the Future and the reassertion of the multipolar world, and in the way that Fukuyama was tremendously wrong after 2001, let's say. And I think those two ideas can completely coexist. 10 years of relative peace and happy stability, this, in retrospect, the period, let's say 1989, 2001, probably could be seen as some sort of crazy interwar period, right? Just like the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th century were called fin de siècle or la belle époque, like the beautiful time, right? That's quite possible, but it doesn't make it actually less beautiful. 10 years is quite a period of time. So simply to neglect it as some sort of a dream seems to me to be a bit pretentious, because lots of things were happening and we can actually learn from those things. It might not have been only an American moment. I mean, in Eastern Europe, it was a moment of immense liberation in Czechoslovakia until it collapsed into Czechia and Slovakia, let's say. So in many ways, one could see history unfolding, and that enthusiasm could have been squandered by now, but it was quite an enthusiasm. And as we talked a minute ago, enthusiasm in history matters. It's very difficult to build a successful society with some sort of pessimistic narrative about the endless struggles of some entities. One simply has to give meaning to lives of people, to your own life, thinking that you're part of something more meaningful than an eternal struggle of country A against country B. Plus, if I can add something more. You mentioned that the traces of this were seen and visible from 2015, and of course they were. So Syria was already a nightmare. Ukraine was already a nightmare. That people didn't pay attention, I mean, it's their fault. It was there all the time. Actually, it was the downfall of the Arab Spring which showed where the situation is going. But probably in retrospect, 2001 and September 11th is going to be seen as this moment, which is sort of creating, I mean, transforming Fukuyama's dream into a nightmare. And if I'm not mistaken, even he himself wrote an apologetic piece after September 11th, basically claiming that history didn't end.
Yeah, yeah. I want to offer you an analogy and ask you what you think about it. Some of the attempts, for example, in the United States to explain the rise of populism domestically, and variations of that came up in Europe as well, had to do with the failure of spreading the kind of fruits of globalization and liberal economic order and so on and so forth. So some people, blue collar working class, primarily were left out of the new economic order, and that's been a kind of popular and important explanation for why the Trump movement and variations of it in Europe have been on the ascendancy. Do you think there is a parallel to that in international relations? So in other words, might we think about the kind of reemergence of the classic balance of power, or the strengthening of it, or the decline of liberal internationalism, if that's what we're calling it as a shortcut? Is that a result of a similar kind of failure on the international sphere to make internationalism really international, for example? It's a variation on something we asked earlier. But
yeah, indeed. So what seems to me is that the logical consequence, if there was ever a serious thrust toward the altering of the structure of the world, would have been a reform of the United Nations, and especially the reform of the Security Council. But that didn't happen, curiously enough. And I think it was never really seriously entertained by anybody throughout the 90s. There was a lot of talk about it, but nothing nearing. So basically, there is a straitjacket from 1945, which is still sort of, like the gravitational point of this future world center, global governance and whatnot, which is at best obsolete. And we see it now worrisomely that United Nations are very rarely mentioned even. I mean, there are problems all over the world. I mean, Yemen is burning, Ethiopia is burning, Syria barely stabilized, Ukraine is burning. And you would expect, even during the Cold War, United Nations were much more proactive. Okay, they were talking shop of the two superpowers and so on, but there were things, blue helmets, this and that. At least some ethics was debated somewhere. It seems to me that descending into balance of power, which is not ideological at all, would basically strip any sort of moral pretense. And then it's a question for you whether even a hypocrisy would be preferable than actually abandoning any sort of norms, apart of the norms of dulce decorum est pro patria amor.
yeah. That's a very good question. I mean, look, in some way that takes me to the role of moral considerations in this competition between, if you will, two world orders. And this is what's bothered me about the Mearsheimer kind of argument. The argument being, you know, had we been more careful in the early 90s, had we heeded Russian warnings about stop the expansion of NATO eastward, we wouldn't have found ourselves in this kind of situation. It was that expansion of NATO eastward that violated the balance of power, or any potential for Russia enjoying the balance of power. And that is why we find ourselves where we are. And this is why it's all our fault, basically. It's all the West's fault, is a sort of caricature blurb version of Mearsheimer's argument. Actually, not so much a caricature. I think that is the argument. And one issue with that, I mean, there is something to that, I think, on the one hand. Historically, you know, there certainly were some humiliating aspects of how the United States treated Russia after 1991. There were also some useful, I think it's a complicated picture, actually. But what I wanted to focus on is the moral point that you raised. And in a way, the problem with that argument is that it really pits two worldviews together and ignores the fact that one of them, at least in theory, is morally superior to the other. So one worldview is the spheres of influence worldview. Never mess with somebody else's backyards if you don't want to get shot. And the other worldview is, at least in principle, the sort of self-determination, liberal internationalism worldview, where countries should be able to determine their own future. Now, the West, broadly speaking, at least says that it is committed to the self-determination worldview. The problem with equating between, and that's hypocritical. Often it's not, often it takes over countries in spite of this self-determination worldview. Examples can be proliferated for sure, and that's all good and well. The problem with equating the Mearsheimer idea of backyards and the liberal internationalist idea of self-determination is that it completely ignores the interests of third parties. So, places like Ukraine and Poland and the Baltics generally wanted nothing to do with the Russians anymore. And if all you say is, well, they were in the backyard of the Russians, you should have been a little bit more careful. That's a little bit akin to saying, don't make that man angry if you don't want him to beat you up. It's like saying to Chris Rock in the Oscars, you shouldn't have insulted Will Smith if you didn't want to get slapped. Well, you shouldn't go around slapping people as a sort of moral principle in the first place. So if we're already talking about the sort of moral difference, isn't there an inherent, and this is a question the sort of realists have a problem with, isn't there an inherent superiority to the self-determination model? Yes, the West fails to live up to it half the time, but at least there is a principle on the basis of which then you can criticize the West. What principle are you going to use to criticize Russia?
Yeah. Well, given that I'm not an ethicist, of course, I love to discuss morality and so on, because I'm completely unburdened by knowledge on the matter, right? But I don't think one needs to be deep into it to understand some of the facets of the problem.
No.
Like, for instance, take WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks damaged substantially the U.S. foreign policy and the foreign policy of different countries of European Union. because they spread most dirt about it, but also because the standard of expectation and code of behavior from the US diplomats and European diplomats is way higher than the one we use to measure the behavior of China or Russia in international relations. We wouldn't be surprised to hear about such scandals in the Russian or Chinese environment at all. And this is a burden that the West simply has to deal with. The hypocritical pretenses of the West are exactly a mixed bag of expectations that one has from the West and doesn't really have from Russia and China at this moment. This is an honest question then whether I really think that this type of hypocrisy is still very much superior to simply saying, yeah, well, at least Russians are saying it as it is. Because ultimately, even the daughters and sons of Chinese of Russian oligarchs, they live in the West, and the Chinese elite is being schooled in the West. I don't really see many people fleeing eastwards. That says something. I don't know what it says actually exactly, but I know it does say something. So the thing is that there will be new battlegrounds in time to come. I hope there will be moral battlegrounds, let's say, or that the superpowers will compete in the better way of, like, I don't know, energy, smart energy savings and so on.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid that's not going to be the case.
Yeah,
And then people are going to have to make nasty choices.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question of hypocrisy that you raise is actually crucial because and if the sort of so-called West or the Western world are the hypocrites in this case, the good thing about the hypocrite is there is a basis for embarrassing them back into virtue. And there's a basis for embarrassing them, to use an old word. There's a basis for embarrassing them, if nothing else, back into a good behavior, because the principle which the hypocrisy states is part of their self-understanding, right? It's part of their identity. So human rights, even if they are not ascribed to, is supposedly part of the declared identity, at least on and off, of a Western power. And at least what you can do is expose the discrepancy between the stated identity and the practice. And that often, changes history. I mean, we've talked about this in another context. There's actually a really interesting role to embarrassment in international relations. Some will argue that American progress in the civil rights legislation, in the second half of the 20th century, was in part due to them being embarrassed into adhering to what they actually declare by the Soviet Union. So as they were competing, for sympathy with the Soviets said, well, look at Jim Crow. Why are you lecturing us? And that had a real impact. And so, yes, hypocrisy is in some ways superior to sort of the cold, national grandeur realism of the Russians and the Chinese, because it gives you a basis for moving back.
Yeah, and I mean, don't mistake me for some sort of moral crusader at all costs. I'm just thinking, okay, firstly, this discussion also belongs to the story of importance of emotions, because narratives matter equally. Both sides, both winners of the Cold War, assumed highly moralistic discourse, and they were crusading in the Cold War from that basis, and therefore they were also vulnerable. Just like, for instance, today, the US is much more hurt by Guantanamo than Russia would, or than China is by the violence of Uyghurs, even though numbers-wise that can't be compared. But people don't expect ultimately China to treat dissent differently, and they do expect the US to extend certain rights such as habeas corpus even to the non-US citizens, even to the non-US citizens indicted of terrorism. So this is a high expectation, and we shouldn't get rid of it. And finally, then again, to compare it to the internal politics that you mentioned, this certainly hurts Obama much more than it hurts Trump, for instance, because Trump is emblematic of this sort of, let's say, self-interest foreign policy, whereas Obama is more emblematic for this sort of outreach of like the beacon type of, or exporting of democracy.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said, which in a way brings me back full circle. If you do have a balance of power that's kind of emerged today, one one lopsided aspect of it, one weird asymmetry in this balance of power is that you're going to have one part of the system, one part of the balance that at least purports to care for principle more than the other part. So the sort of West, as it were, is going to continue to declare allegiance to internationalism and to individualism and to human rights. And openly, by the way, both the Chinese and the Russians in their different ways are going to talk about ideas of national glory and of collective attainment and of sort of mystical histories. And I want to go back to something you said. So that's interesting. And I wonder if you compare that version, that 21st century version of the balance of power to the 19th century, whether those powers were more truly realist, all of them, and than we have in our contemporary version. But I want to go back to something that you said. So that's a big difference, even if we do have an incarnation, a new incarnation of the balance of powers. And then also connected to that, you said you thought that the alliance between Russia and China was almost inherently less stable. One way to think about that is that it's inherently less stable because there isn't an idea at the bottom of it in the same way that there is on the Western part of the balance of power.
Yeah, well, again, probably many things get convoluted by the end of the conversation, always, such as the nature of our talks. But I think at least to clarify a couple of things. So whether this was a pretense or not, this export of democracy, democratic peace, global international order, I think that can't be answered with either or. It seems to me that for some people it was, and for some people it wasn't. It's not unlikely that the same person or policymaker or institution can do both at the same time. You know, if you give it a try, if it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's still in the US national interest. So either way, it's okay. And it was basically testing. And not only the US, I think that the whole West was banking on a theory that increased globalization and trade interdependence is somehow going to create a superstructure. It's kind of funny because also, you know, I mean, those same people were destroying Marxism at the same time. And this is almost a Marxist type of analysis of what's going to happen. Like you create some economic structure and then ultimately ideological superstructure is going to appear. That doesn't seem to be happening. So the world is economically tremendously interdependent, but what we see is growing instability. Countries don't give a damn if Suez Canal is going to be clogged for a couple of days, if the prices of iron are going to go double in a week, and so on and so forth. The other things become priority. So just like in 1914, when economic interdependence between the superpowers was quite high, they didn't prevent them at all to go into murderous civil war, basically European civil war, which lasted from 1914 until 1945, which destroyed Europe for decades to come. And mind you, those were really smart people. We are not talking about some people who don't know what they're doing. They knew what they were doing, and yet they ended up the way they did. And indeed, I would like to have a separate talk with this about you, but the open question is, if it continues the way it goes now, you say that the West is going to keep advocating for some sort of human rights standard, which by extension means some sort of global international humanitarian yardstick. I wonder if that's going to happen. Because again, the West is suspect to elections. The elections bring about changes. Last such rotation in the US brought about quite some erosion of that type of thinking. And we shouldn't be, I think, fooled about it. It's dicey. And if that happens, then, as they say, the center will not hold. And the EU, which is archetypical product of globalization of the 90s, would be really endangered. Because the EU will be in much more delicate position if this type of playing
could
becomes business as
usual. Do you think that this kind of blatant action by Russia could actually buttress commitment to ideas of human rights in the West, that we kind of became complacent about them because the challenge was not significant. And now that sort of the idea, as it were, is under attack by an illiberal power and coalition, they might get some life breathed into them.
I don't know. I'm really, it's really, I left my crystal ball in the other room. I mean, but the whole thing is, to me, boils down to I'm fervently watching, as we all are, the media since the end of February, and I really got worried with the way how people are stunned in the West. People are stunned by the fact that the West more or less rallied and came to the defense of Ukraine. So as if even the Western politicians were, favorably surprised by how they got lined up in the end. And then there were much talk about how this thing is actually reinvigorated in the West.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking to myself, okay, well, I mean, how to put it? You're not supposed to be surprised. It's a alliance, and it should act as alliance. And secondly, I'm not happy at all that it got reinvigorated by these events. I'd much prefer that the events didn't go that way.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Vlada, this has been really, really great. Let us maybe just give a sort of preview of coming attractions to our listeners. Vlada and I are planning to have some future conversations about, among others, the role of emotions in international relations. Potentially some conversations focused on some key texts that have to do with the recent conflicts, maybe some of Putin's interesting speeches, maybe some other key texts that we choose. So please do stay tuned to future episodes of the podcast on this. Vlado, like always, a very, very great pleasure.
Likewise, Nir.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right.